Good morning, this is Dr. David A. Padgett. Uh, Today is April 21st, 2021, and this is the last day of class for the semester, not the last day of the semester. So let me just pull up my screen here, do a little housekeeping first, and then we'll get into the lecture for today. Okay, what's due? Have a reading assignment, of course, that goes along with this week's quiz. So we'll get into the rest of the reading assignment today. Again, those of you who are not planning on being teachers must complete research quiz 4. If you are planning on being a teacher, it's very important that you complete Globe assignment 2. Okay, so that's what's due this week. Also due is the article review 9. There will not be an article review 10. I will give everyone a freebie on that one. Article review 9 is due on April 26th, Monday. The final exam project will be released on Friday. I'll talk a little bit about that today at the end of the lecture, but let's move on to the lecture itself. So today's lecture focuses upon, I'll go to view as student. Today's lecture focuses upon the political and cultural geography of Russia and neighboring countries. And so let's go to the textbook to get into this portion of the lecture. So if you remember, if we look at the Russia and neighboring countries, chapter 4, beginning on page 138, these 12 countries that we're studying now used to be part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That was until 1991 when that country fell apart. And so what led up to the collapse of the Soviet Union were many things, but one, of course, was the Cold War. So after the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union were on the same side, fought on the same side in the Second World War, fought on the side that obviously was victorious in the Second World War. And what we saw after that was a competition between the USA and USSR to become dominant. The USSR had a socialist communist system. The USA had a democratic capitalist system. So we had two diametrically opposed ideals during the Cold War, which really wasn't a Cold War in the United States and the Soviet. Well, it was cold in the USA and the Soviet Union. A hot war is when you have bullets flying, people getting shot, that kind of thing. Now, technically in the Cold War, there weren't any battles in the Soviet Union or in the United States, but they took place at other places on Earth. So, for example, almost right after the Second World War, we had the Korean War during the 1950s. So the Soviets were on the side of North Korea, and the United States, we backed the South Koreans. Even though that battle did not take place in the United States, I believe about 50,000 US soldiers died in the Korean War. Many more were wounded, including my uncle, who came back from the Korean War, a 100% disabled veteran with shrapnel wounds. Then after that, there was the Vietnam War. So the Soviets sided with the North Vietnamese NVA, who were more communist leading. The United States backed the South Vietnamese. At the end of that war, you wound up with Vietnam being a communist nation. The Korean War ended up kind of in a tie. So you still have North Korea and South Korea divided politically along that peninsula. This was all part of the Cold War. Then we moved into Ethiopia versus Somalia in the 1970s. Those countries went to war then for 9 years. In the 1980s, we had the United States backed Somalia, the Soviets backed Ethiopia in that conflict. Then we moved to the 1980s. We had Iran versus Iraq went to war against each other with the the United States sold arms to both sides, but that's a whole different story. So we mainly backed Iraq, excuse me. So Iraq, who we ended up invading twice in subsequent years, was our ally. And the Soviets backed the other side in Iran. So the Cold War had its hotness happening, but not in the United States, not on U.S. soil, not on USSR soil, but certainly as these two nations tried to establish themselves as world powers, a lot of people died. In other parts of the world. So yes, it was a Cold War, but not necessarily on USA or USSR soil. So what happened to the Soviet Union? Why did they collapse in 1991? Well, there are a variety of things that we can look at. Let's look at it from an economic standpoint. Now, a socialist system sounds good for a lot of reasons, okay? First of all, medical care is free. In a purely socialist economy, medical care is free. No medical bills. Imagine that. As opposed to in our capitalist system, in the capitalist system in the United States, the number one reason why people will go bankrupt in the United States is because of medical bills. In some cases, it's for medical issues you can't control. Cancer, for instance, you can't control whether or not you get cancer or a lot of other diseases. And so you wind up in the hospital, your insurance is unable to cover everything, and you end up broke. It's kind of a cruel system if you think about it. Whereas in a socialist system, it's free medical care. And in some cases, we can see the results of that when we compare our medical, or when you compare the health of United States citizens versus Canadian citizens. They have more of a socialized medicine system. Or if you compare us to Cuba, a much poorer country that has, in some cases, better health outcomes because people have free access to medical care. We don't. You have to pay. You don't have insurance, you're on the hook for the rest of your life. You're selling off your belongings, right? Also, more closely related to your concerns is in a socialist system, there's free tuition, no student loans. Student loans and the struggle that a lot of young people have with student loans right now is a lead story today. The president is being asked to forgive student loan debt so that people can get on with their lives. And so a lot of people say that they wish they had never taken out a student loan. So it wasn't worth it, right? Looking back 10 years. So, but in a socialist system, free tuition. So, well, what happened? You would think, wow, you got all these advantages, all these guarantees in a socialist system, but there are other things in a socialist system that, okay, for instance, labor. Labor is a huge part of any economic system. In a socialist system, everybody's labor is valued equally. So if you are, let's say, a judge, you're a judge if you were a judge in a socialist system, you'd make the same amount of money as the person playing a judge on TV, which is a big difference. The real judge might make $200,000 a year. The actor playing a judge might make $1 million per episode, but that would be in a capitalist system. In a socialist system, they both make the same thing. A school teacher makes the same thing as an NBA basketball player. A school crossing guard makes the same thing as an attorney. Everybody's labor is valued equally in a purely socialist system. Nobody has a reason to look down on anybody else. Oh, I'm a pro ball player. I make millions of dollars, so I'm going to look down on a teacher because he or she might crack 40, 50,000 a year, right? Which in some cases, or in some ways, doesn't seem right. It's like, wait a minute. I mean, we didn't have any basketball last year, right? For a long time. I don't think anybody missed the NBA from a survival standpoint. We also had teachers kind of halfway not there last year. And the long-term effects of our not having teachers is going to be much greater than the long-term effects of our not having basketball last year. But yet, in a capitalist system, the basketball player gets millions of dollars. The basketball player will make more money in one season, or half a season, and some of them maybe a few games, than a teacher will make during his or her entire career. But that's capitalism. Socialist system, nobody's better than anybody else. Another thing about capitalism versus socialism, in a socialist system, there is no private ownership of business. The government owns everything. The government owns the car factories, the grocery stores, the newspapers, everything. You can't go out and start your own business and become an entrepreneur in a purely socialist system. So those last 2 points might make socialism a little bit less attractive because, of course, you have no real incentive to be innovative and creative and perhaps make improvements upon the status quo that will result in your becoming independently wealthy. That doesn't happen in a purely socialist system. In our system, the capitalist system, that's what it's all about. Right? Rags to riches. You know, you have people that, like, say Steve Jobs' father came here as an immigrant, and Steve Jobs becomes this computer technology giant, right? From relatively simple beginnings. Or look at somebody like Jay-Z, who grew up in housing projects, and now he's one of the 6 recognized Black billionaires in the United States. I don't think he's even 50 years old yet. So if you are in a capitalist system, if you're innovative, you're creative, and there's demand for whatever it is you create, then you can become very wealthy individually. So there's lots of incentives there to be innovative and creative. So the upside of that is, in a capitalist system, yes, you can become very wealthy, but then you also have to have poor people in a capitalist system. You cannot have a capitalist system without poverty. That's the motivating factor. I'm going to school, I'm doing work, I'm going to make this money, so I will not be one of those poor people out here that I see every day. That's incentive. You can't have a purely capitalist system without unemployment. The ranks of unemployed, again, incentivize those who are employed. If you had 100% employment, if you had guaranteed employment, what kind of workforce would you have? How incentivized would they be to do the best that they could? If you had a system where people were guaranteed some level of success, how motivated would those people be? Right? Think about it. If at Tennessee State University, no matter what you did, as long as you showed up for class sometime, the worst grade you get is a C. What if it was like that at TSU? Maybe not you, but you know people who would graduate with a 2.5 GPA and do absolutely nothing for 4 years. Just enroll in classes, kind of show up when they felt like it, get that C, and live their lives. But then at the end of the day, how productive would that person be? How creative? I mean, how would that person have any skills? No. And that would, I'm not gonna put percentages on it, but I'm willing to bet there'd be a lot of people that would go that route. But it's not like that. We have a competitive system. Like, look, if you work hard and you're excellent, you'll get an A in the class. If you're almost excellent, but you're better than average, you'll get a B in the class. If you're average, you'll get a C. If you don't perform, you get a D or an F. And if you get too many Fs, you're going home. You're not going to be at Tennessee State University anymore. That's a competitive system. Winners and losers. Right? So people are incentivized in a competitive capitalist system to make a better light bulb, to build a better car, right? To make a different form of music that's maybe digital. And now we no longer have CDs and DVDs. Streaming, we've gone to streaming now. No more need for DVDs and CDs. So whoever was in the business of DVDs and CDs, they're not in business anymore. Somebody is out of a job, out of a business. It's winners and losers in a capitalist system. But as an individual, you can become very wealthy and win in this system, while somebody else is going to be homeless. A lot of somebody else's. But so that perhaps in some part explains why, from an economic standpoint, capitalist countries are fare better than communist nations. You know, there's no real incentive in a socialist system to be innovative or creative, because it's not the spoils, the reward does not come to the individual. So as you go into the reading, you'll also notice that, you know, as we look at this culture and political geography of Russia and neighboring countries, you'll also see that I have this PowerPoint, this slide deck called "The Struggle for Democracy in the Commonwealth of Independent States." The neighboring countries, or countries of neighboring Russia, are also sometimes called the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. So if you remember, maybe you don't, but these countries were once part of the Soviet Union. And now they're independent countries for about the last 30 years or so. Now, during the period of time when these countries were republics in the Soviet Union, they were under a communist system. In some cases, they were annexed. They didn't they didn't ask to be invited to become part of the Soviet Union. In some cases, the Soviet Union just kind of took over. So part of the reason that these countries are no longer part of the Soviet Union is because they weren't really happy being there in the first place. So in 1991, when they had the opportunity, they got out for a variety of reasons. Now, in their communist system, it's more of a centralized system of what we call top-down micromanagement, where everything has to go through the centralized government in Moscow. That's not how we operate here in the United States. If a local government, if a city wanted to build a new bridge, that would be that city's decision. Some cases, they wouldn't even have to go to the state unless there were some state permits. But in many cases, a lot of decisions are made on the local government level. Some decisions are made on the state government level. Then, of course, there's the federal government level. It's not centralized. Whereas in the former Soviet Union, everything had to go through Moscow. Everything was very tightly controlled, and these countries didn't feel free. They didn't get to vote for leadership. There's no voting. So you would think that when these countries had the opportunity to become democratic, that this would be an easy transition. Of course, these countries that were caught in the yoke of the Soviet Union would jump at the chance at being more like us here in the United States and be democratic, electing their own leaders. But if you look at this whole system of democracy as we know it, it's relatively new in terms of the scope of human history. We humans have been ruled mostly by people for whom we didn't vote. Czars, monarchs, kings, queens, pharaohs, emperors. You know, that most of human history, that's been the ruler, a king. You don't get to vote for the king. You don't get to vote for who's emperor. You don't get to vote for who's pharaoh. Right? I mean, so most people in many parts of the world, this whole idea of democracy is a new and interesting concept, and it's intimidating. There's a lot of responsibility that goes with democracy. You know, you vote and you put some person in office, and if that person turns out to be a nut, then guess what? You're responsible for putting that nut in office. A lot of people might, well, I don't know. I would have wished that people felt that way in 2016, but obviously they didn't. But at the end of the day, we as a people are responsible for our leaders. And even given that responsibility, a lot of people don't engage. Now, people might vote in the national election. 2 years later, when it's the interim election, midway elections, for the congressional or Senate seats, low turnout. Then for local and state elections, even lower. So even those of us who have the right to vote, people died for this right. Some of us still don't do it. Not really. So how will we expect people in other parts of the world who've never had the opportunity, who've don't know anything about democracy, why would we expect them to shift over so quickly? There's a saying that you can't miss what you never had. If you never had democracy, what do you miss about it? Some people might like having a king or a queen. That way they aren't responsible for any decision making. If the king says something and it goes wrong, guess who that's on? That's on the king. If we elect somebody who gets us into somewhere we don't want to go, then that's on us as voters. So the move to democracy is not necessarily something that is going to be fluid or people are just going to jump on board right away. As you can see in these visuals, in all these countries that are recent members of the Democratic Country Club, if you want to call it that, had conflict, revolutions, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Ukraine. These not necessarily peaceful transitions. Here we had in Kyrgyzstan, protesters stormed the palace. And now this look familiar? January 6th of this year. Now, in our case, protesters stormed the White House. People had to evacuate, but hours later, everything was back to normal. But in other parts of the world, sometimes these revolts are permanent. You know, these people go in there and they take over. So this whole issue of democracy, lawlessness breaking out in some of these countries. You know, Belarus struggle to become democratic countries. It's not easy, but these countries they are transitioning, trying to transition towards democracy, but there are still some challenges besides just trying to grasp the idea of being democratic. There's some other issues that stand in the way. So let's go back to the textbook and go to images. And I want to go to figure 4.34. Okay, I'm going to have to start over. Apparently, here, try this again. Here, it's images, chapter 4, 4.34. Okay, so now this map, this choropleth map, is a map of Russia, southern Russia, and the Caucasus region. So here's Russia. And then here's the border between Russia and the country of Georgia. And we also have the country of Armenia here and the country of Azerbaijan. Now, you'll notice both in the textbook and from this map that there's a strong relationship between nationality and ethnicity. Now, when I say ethnicity, I don't mean like ethnicity in the way that we describe it. In our country, we say that ethnicity is Black, white, Latinx, Native American, Alaskan, Native Alaskan, Asian, and Pacific Islander. So we have these. Now, remember, there's no biological concept or definition of race. This is just purely a political social construct that we human beings have created for whatever reason, and we're stuck with it, unfortunately. But there's no biological basis for it. There's a legal basis. So, for example, if you're 1/8 Black in Virginia, you're Black. If you're 1/32 Black in Louisiana, you're Black. It's a legal statute. So a person from Louisiana who's, say, 2/32 or 1/16 Black could move to Virginia and become white legally in this country. So it's this race thing is a mess. But ethnicity has a biological marker called DNA. So essentially, an ethnic group is an extended family. People weren't as mobile as they are now for most of human history. We weren't flying around on planes. Not everybody was getting on a ship. Even today, only about 12% of people are doing most of the flying. The other 88% of people are not flying around the world. There's or around wherever. So in terms of ethnicity has a biological basis. That's why when you do the 23andMe, now parts of you might end up showing up in North America if you happen to have Native American genes, but the rest of those genes come from DNA that cannot be associated with a specific region on Earth based upon the fact those people have been there for thousands of years and they've been somewhat insular. Don't marry outside your ethnic group, in other words. Keep it in the family. In fact, there's some parts of the world where half of marriages are between first and second cousins. In our part of the world, that's a no-no. Other parts of the world, that's normality. Marry your first cousin in some kind of arranged marriage. That's how you keep it in the family, keep it in the ethnic group. So if you notice, in Russia, the green color area symbol represents where Russian ethnics are dominant. In Georgia, notice that the kind of light brown or tan color area symbol means that's where people of Georgian descent are dominant. Azeris in Azerbaijan, Armenians in Armenia. So you have countries that are named after the ethnic group that's dominant within them. That's not anything like the United States. And as a matter of fact, that's the opposite. Our motto is e pluribus unum. It's Latin for from many one. So in our case, we have all these people, all these different ethnic groups and people from all over the world come together and form this one nation this one people that we call Americans, right? All these different bloods just mixing together in this thing that we call the United States of America. That is not the case. In other parts of the world, the country is named after the dominant ethnic group. So if you we know some of us as African Americans, it's hard being a minority in this country, but we're not constrained to that in terms of politics. There are Black Republicans. I don't know what they're thinking, but you could be a Democrat on Tuesday and a Republican on Wednesday. Right. If the Democrats are dominant and you want to become a Democrat, you can do that. But in Georgia, let's say, if you happen to be an Armenian living in Georgia, you can't become a Georgian. You can't say, obviously, if you're in a country that's named after the dominant ethnic group and you're not part of that ethnic group, do you really think you're going to get a fair shake? Do you really think your vote's going to count? Do you really think that anything is going to be done for you? Do you really think your viewpoints are going to be heard if the country is named after the dominant ethnic group and you're not part of that group? So that's another reason that democracy is difficult, because people are going to say, look, this isn't fair. I can't become, if I'm an Armenian living in Azerbaijan, I can't become an Azeri. I am who I am. It's a permanent condition. You can't switch ethnic groups. You can switch parties, but you can't switch ethnic groups. This is a very different social political phenomenon than ours, right? Which can lead to political strife. Let's look at the case of Chechnya. So in the textbook in here, I have an article about Chechnya and Russia, 20 years of conflict, bloody battle, 20-year battle. This is from 2014, and I'm sure this battle is still raging, and it's not just people, they got guns and tanks and everything out there, you know. So Chechnya is trying to get away from Russia. Chechnya here is this yellow color area symbol. The people there are Chechen, so they're in the Chechnya Republic inside of Russia. Now, they would like to be out of Russia like the Georgians and Azeris and Armenians and have their own country. But Russia's not letting that happen. Well, what's part of the problem? Well, the Chechens are Muslims. You know, they're Muslims and they're inside of Russia. Now, when the Soviet Union was intact, part of their ideal of governance was atheism. Now, you might ask, well, why would people want to have an atheist government? Now, our government is not, we don't have an official religion in the United States, but we're certainly not a theology. We're not certainly not a theocracy. A theocracy is a government that is based upon a specific religious faith, like Saudi Arabia, you know, or say Afghanistan is the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Iran is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Clearly, they let you know right up with the name what kind of country it is in terms of the dominant religious faith. We don't have that. Okay, so you might say, well, what about the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God? That under God was made part of the Pledge of Allegiance as a result of the Cold War between the Soviets and the USA. It happened as an act of Congress in 1954. Because the Soviets and the United States were struggling, they were battling for dominance all over the world. So they were trying to influence different countries to choose one side or the other. So the United States started calling the Soviets godless. They called them godless because of the atheist ideology within their governance. And to really bring it home, one nation under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, under God. So look, the United States was saying, see, we're different from them. They're atheists. Why would anybody want to have an atheist? Now, we have a secular government. We have freedom of religion with the secular government. The communist ideal was not to have freedom of religion. So a lot of people of faith fled the Soviet Union. Part of the reason the Chechens feel uncomfortable is even though the Soviet Union isn't around anymore, they still don't feel free as Muslims in Russia. So they're trying to get out. And so again, here's a case of where one's religious faith is tied to their nationality. If the Chechens form their own nation, it would probably be called the Islamic Republic of Chechnya. And so here's another way that democracy is another way that the former Soviet Union was destabilized, let's say, was because you had people who were being oppressed and suppressed in terms of their religious beliefs, which is of course tied to ethnicity. Looking deeper at the relationship between ethnicity and nationality, we can go look at the Ukraine crisis. So this is from 2014. So what happened was Russia invaded Ukraine and took over part of the country. And they're still there 5-6 years later. Which goes against pretty much every United Nations convention I can think of. If there's a sovereign nation, another nation is not supposed to just march in and take over part of it. I mean, even though we kind of did that with Iraq and we kind of did that with Afghanistan, we mean the United States, but it's not. It hasn't been an occupation. Now we've had military presence there. We did occupy Iraq for a period of time, but it was never the goal to take it over permanently and make Iraq part of the United States. That was not the goal, right? But in the case of Russia invading Ukraine and taking over the Crimean region, they don't ever plan to leave, right? So what happened? Well, let's look at a map that partially explains what happened. So here's the Ukraine ethno-linguistic map. So this is the country of Ukraine. And this area over here to the east or the right is Russia. So the Russians invaded Ukraine and took over this Crimean Peninsula. If you notice, in terms of ethnicity, this part of Ukraine had a very dominant Russian population. So when the nation of Ukraine was brought together after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were still Russians living in Ukraine. They didn't all leave, even though the country is named Ukraine after Ukrainian people. So some of these Russians over the years have probably they definitely felt like they were not getting a fair shake. So they, from inside of Ukraine, conspired to assist their brothers and sisters in Russia in basically taking over. If they had their way, they might have Russia just take the whole nation of Ukraine back. But they couldn't quite do that, so they just took the Crimean Peninsula. And there wasn't a whole lot of resistance when the tanks rolled in the Crimean Peninsula and took it over. There wasn't a whole lot of resistance because the people there were Russian. They were like, welcome, help us get us out from under these Ukrainians. So again, here you have a case of where one's loyalty to their ethnicity outweighs or supersedes their loyalty to their nation. What do we say? Blood is thicker than water. So this also, this alignment of nationality with ethnicity, or in some cases, well, in this case, because you have a nation called Ukraine, you got other people in it who are Russian, who aren't Ukrainian, who don't feel as if they're getting a fair shake. So they invite their Russian comrades in to come try to take over, to empower them inside of Ukraine. And maybe, like I said, if they had their way, they would take the whole thing over. So these ethnic conflicts, these ethnic struggles are something that we're not familiar with in our country. But they call for a different political landscape in the former Soviet Union. Okay, so we'll end there. Today is the last day of class, not the last day of the semester. The final exam project will be released to the Dropbox by Friday, so you'll have a week to complete it. It'll be released on the 23rd. It'll be due on the 29th, and the 29th is the last day of the semester. That's it. Nothing else done, over with. So if you have any questions, please ask. Be looking out for the final exam on Friday. Don't procrastinate on the final exam. That won't be a good idea. If there are no questions, I will end for today, and be prepared for the final exam project.